Sahul was a single ice age continent where Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were joined, but the path to it still ran straight through saltwater. Even when seas were lower, deep channels in Wallacea never became dry land, so the final approach demanded open ocean crossings, not just walking. That makes this one of the oldest known human migrations that required true voyaging, where the horizon becomes a decision you can't reverse. Before Australia existed as an idea, there was only a coastline, a line of islands, and a gap of water that refused every shortcut. The story begins with people who already lived with the sea, not as scenery, but as a pantry, a highway, and a threat. Along tropical shores, they learned the tides the way inland people learn trails. By repetition, until pattern becomes instinct. They watched currents wrap around headlands, watched wind change the texture of the water, and noticed that the ocean had lanes. They learned that driftwood does not arrive randomly, and that floating things come from somewhere you can sometimes predict. They learned the language of birds, not in words, but in timing when flocks leave, when they return, and what direction they choose at dusk. They learned that storms make the sea loud, but also make it honest, because calm water can hide danger longer. And slowly, an idea that begins as fear becomes a plan. If land exists beyond the islands, it can be reached. A first voyage doesn't start with a leap into deep water. It starts with short tests, close to shore, and safe returns that build trust. Every safe return teaches the group that the sea can be negotiated, not mastered, and negotiation is enough. Craft could have been simple ash timbers, bundled reeds, floating platforms, but simple doesn't mean easy when children must sit inside it. To carry people, you need buoyancy, balance, and a way to keep fear from turning into sudden movement at the worst time. To carry a future, you also need fire-making, knowledge protected from spray, cutting tools protected from loss, and food that can survive sun. Open water pernicious, overconfidence. So competence becomes the culture's most valuable inheritance. At the departure shore, preparation looks like silence, because everyone knows the sea is listening. The last moments before launch are not heroic, they are practical tight knots. Redistributed weight, checked bundles, and one final count of heads. Once the craft pushes off, the land behind you begins shrinking immediately. And that shrinking changes what your mind can tolerate. For a while you can still see familiar trees, then you can't, and the sea makes sure you notice the moment it happens. Now you are committed to a direction, and commitment is the difference between travel and drifting. The crossing is not only distance, but time, because hours on water are hours where errors accumulate quietly. A small angle off course becomes a large miss later, and the sea rarely allows a correction without cost. They would have read the sun when they could, and read swells when clouds hid it, because the water always remembers where wind came from. They would have watched for seabirds that fly toward land at certain times, because wings can carry certainty farther than human eyes. They would have felt the current tug sideways, and learnt not to fight it head-on, but to aim with it, like aiming a spear. Even with skill, fatigue becomes the invisible enemy, because tired arms make sloppy strokes, and sloppy strokes invite panic. Thirst becomes louder than hunger, and salt spray makes thirst cruel by wetting the lips while drying the body. Children change the entire logic of a crossing, because they can't be ordered into endurance, they must be protected into it. So adult focus becomes a wall around them, a shared discipline that keeps the craft stable when waves slap the sides. In rougher water, the sea turns from surface into weight, and every rise and fall teaches humility. Then comes the moment every voyager waits for, a smudge on the horizon that might be cloud, might be island, might be hope. As the shape grows, it becomes unmistakable, and the group feels a quiet surge that is not victory yet, only possibility. Approach is dangerous too, because reefs, surf, and cross-currents can punish you exactly when you think you've won. Landing is messy and urgent, jumping into shallows, dragging craft up, pulling bundles clear before the tide reclaims them. Only after the first fire is lit again on new ground does the crossing truly end, because now survival has a base. But the larger change has already happened, because once a group crosses open sea successfully, the horizon stops being a boundary forever. This is the earliest part of the story that feels like a modern human power, the ability to decide that separation can be defeated. Sahul waits inland like a vast unread book, and the first page is always the coast, where food is predictable and directions are clear. Yet even on that first night, the new land feels different. because every unfamiliar sound reminds you you are not returning soon. The late truth of part 1 is simple. The crossing is not a single brave moment, but a social technology planning, timing and trust repeated until it works. And if it worked once, it could work again, which is how a voyage becomes a migration and a landing becomes a people. Reaching Sahul was not one perfect leap across a single gap, because the path ran through Wallacea, an island world that forces repeated decisions. Even with Ice Age sea levels lower, Wallacea remains broken by deep channels that never become land. Which means boats are not optional. Modern researchers debate the exact routes, but the reality stays simple. People had to cross open water again and again. Some models propose a more northern corridor through islands that point toward New Guinea, while other reconstructions emphasize a more southern run toward northern Australia. But from the perspective of a small craft, corridors are not theories. They are stretches of water that must be survived. Each island is both a refuge and a trap, because it can offer water and shelter, or it can offer nothing but heat and hunger. So the migrations are not smooth. They are pulsed, with stops long enough for knowledge to harden into routine. You do not become a sea crosser in one afternoon. You become one by repeating what works until it becomes culture. A landing teaches where reefs hide, and the next departure avoids them. A storm teaches which lashings fail first, and the next build reinforces them. A long drift teaches that currents do not respect your intention, and the next launch waits for better alignment. Boats evolve through failure, because failure is expensive and the sea charges full price. Ropes improve, knots improve, platforms widen, and stability becomes more important than elegance. Paddles stop being branches and start being shaped tools, because endurance is what turns distance into possibility. Travel happens in more than one craft when it can, because redundancy is how a people survives disasters. Group discipline becomes as important as craft design, because one panicked move can flip everything. Children learn the rules early, because in a boat, even a child's movement changes balance. Adults learn to speak less during crossings, because calm is contagious, and so is fear. Elders teach patience, because leaving too early is how you die close to shore with the worst kind of regret. Some crossings are short enough to tempt arrogance, and those are dangerous, because the sea kills people who start believing. Other crossings are long enough that land disappears, and that is the true threshold. Because once land is gone, your world is only the craft. The ocean becomes a test of coordination, because paddling is not just strength, it is rhythm shared by many bodies. Food strategy becomes strict, because weakness shows first in decision-making, and bad decisions kill the group faster than hunger. Water strategy becomes sacred, because you cannot drink the world around you, and thirst makes people irrational. Fire-making knowledge travels like a guarded treasure, because landing without fire can mean hypothermia even in warm places when bodies are wet and wind is sharp. And across this island world, people leave signs of life that show time depth, occupation, art, pigment use, and repeated return. Those signs do not show a boat in the ground, but they show people living long enough for boat knowledge to mature. That matters, because a single accidental drift does not create a sustained migration, but a seafaring culture can. Generations grow up with salt air as normal, and what was once unimaginable becomes part of childhood. A child watches adults read swells like trails. A child learns that birds mean land, clouds mean land, and the color of water can hint at shallows and reefs. By the time that child has grown, the sea is still dangerous, but it is not mysterious, and that is everything. So when the migration pushes forward again, it does not feel like a gamble, it feels like the next step in a learned system. Islands thin behind them, and the open water widens ahead. And the crossing becomes the longest kind, the kind you can't pretend is accident. The air changes, bird traffic shifts, and the horizon holds a weight it didn't hold before. And when Sahul rises again, it is not just land, it is a future that cannot be carried back in the boat. Landfall is not a victory scene, it is a survival scene, because the sea is behind you and the unknown is in front of you. They step onto Sahul where every smell is new and every plant is untested, and the continent does not explain itself. The first task is water, because without water the landing becomes a slow collapse. They search creek mouths, wetlands, and shaded depressions where fresh water lingers. They bring the craft above the tide line, because losing it means losing mobility, and mobility is life when you don't yet know the land. They check injuries, because a twisted ankle on a new continent is not an inconvenience, it is a sentence. They test food carefully, because starvation pressures bad choices, and bad choices multiply casualties. At first, coasts make sense, because coasts are generous and predictable compared to inland distances. Shellfish, fish, and seabirds can feed a small group while they stabilize and learn. A coastline also gives direction, because you can move without being lost when the water is always on one side. So early movement likely hugs the edge, scouting, returning, moving again, building a mental map, one safe place at a time. Then rivers begin to pull them inland, because rivers are the first highways of any continent. Rivers bring water, plants, animals, and stone sources that make tools possible. They find stone that fractures well, because a dependable edge is the difference between eating and failing. They rebuild toolkits for Sahul, not for the homeland behind them, because materials and prey are different here. They learn the seasons, because timing in Sahul decides everything, especially where rains come and where they don't. They learn the heat, and they learn the distance, because interior landscapes look flat until they crush you with how far they go. They encounter animals that have never learned to fear humans, and that changes hunting in the beginning. At first, fearlessness makes prey easier, and easy is dangerous because it makes people overconfident. But easy does not last, because ecosystems respond when a new predator arrives, and the work becomes real. Archaeology later captures some of this deep time at places like Magedby in northern Australia. That rock shelter preserves dense layers of artifacts like stone tools and ochre, showing repeated occupation and adaptation. Some published interpretations argue the earliest layers could be as old as around 65,000 years, while other researchers dispute that and argue for younger timing. What remains widely accepted is that humans were present very early, on the order of at least around 50,000 years ago, likely earlier depending on the site and method. But even without numbers, the story is visible in behavior, repeated living, tool-making, pigment use, and survival across seasons. Ochre matters because it signals more than utility. It signals meaning carried across time. Meaning is how a group stays a group when the landscape tries to break them into isolated survivors. So knowledge becomes the real technology, more valuable than any single spear or blade. Children learn plants as language, because knowing what to eat is as basic as knowing how to speak. Elders become living archives, holding roots, water sources, and safe seasonal timing inside memory and story. Fire becomes controlled, not only for warmth, but as a way to shape landscapes over time. Burn at the right time, and regrowth arrives later, pulling animals back like a delayed reward. Burn at the wrong time, and the land goes quiet, and quiet can kill. So they do what humans always do when the world is too large. They turn it into a network of known places. Known places become camps. Camps become return points. Return points become tradition, and tradition becomes the invisible infrastructure that allows expansion. The sea crossing was the door, but the true miracle is what comes next. How a people spreads across a continent without roads, without metal, and without written maps, and still thrives. A continent is not conquered by speed, it is learned by repetition, because repetition is how you turn danger into routine. Groups spread in ripples, not lines, because water decides movement more than ambition does. In monsoon regions, rain creates sudden abundance and then vanishes, so planning becomes seasonal discipline. In dry interior zones, the land looks empty until you learn the hidden rules that make it livable. People read subtle signs: bird behavior, plant clusters, soil texture, shade patterns that point toward water you can't see. They learn that travel is not a straight route, it is a chain of reliable places linked by practiced movement. Stone sources become strategic, because good stone makes reliable tools, and reliable tools make long travel possible. Quarries become anchors on the mental map, because returning to good stone is returning to capability. Paths form between these anchors, and paths become tradition, and tradition becomes a kind of road. Over generations, unknown shrinks, not because the land changes, but because knowledge thickens. And while humans are learning Sahul, the planet begins slowly rewriting Sahul's edges. As the Ice Age eases, seas rise and drown old coastlines, erasing early shoreline camps underwater. That means some of the earliest coastal evidence may be lost beneath modern seas, making inland preservation especially important. Inland regions like the Wallacea lakes hold time in dunes and sediments, the way a vault holds memory. Lake Mungo becomes one of the famous places because it preserves evidence of ancient people living beside water that later vanished. Human remains found there, including what's often called Mungo Lady, are widely discussed as roughly around 40,000 to 42,000 years old in many summaries. That number matters because it implies extraordinary depth, not only of presence, but of continuity in a landscape that changes. But what matters even more is what the site suggests about behavior. It suggests community practices around death and memory that go beyond survival by accident. It suggests people with ritual, meaning, and social structure strong enough to persist. That persistence is the real engine of continental spread. Across Sahul, different regions demand different strategies, and people become specialists in their own landscapes. Wetlands teach one kind of knowledge, savannas teach another. Temperate zones demand cold season planning. Dry interior travel demands precision, because mistakes are paid in days of suffering, not minutes of inconvenience. Fire becomes part of long-term planning, shaping regrowth, controlling fuel, and influencing where animals return. Food knowledge becomes systematic, tied to timing, to location, to the invisible calendar of the land. Networks of places connect groups, and those networks allow exchange of knowledge, partners, and survival strategies. And that means this is not a story of a single landing, it is a story of a growing human world. A world built without metal, without cities, without writing, but with something just as powerful. Long memory carried accurately across generations. And then the modern question rests: when exactly did that first door open? And why does the date change what we believe about early humans? Today, the first Australian's arrival is both a human achievement and a scientific debate, because deep time is hard to measure cleanly. The debate is not about whether people reached Sahul by sea, because sea crossings are required no matter which timeline you accept. The debate is about how early those crossings began and how we weigh different kinds of evidence. Some archaeological interpretations argue for very early arrival, including the famous claim of around 65,000 years for early layers at Majedbi. Other researchers dispute that interpretation and argue the earliest occupation is younger, pointing to uncertainties that come with deep dating. Some genetic model approaches have suggested people in closer to around 50,000 years ago under certain assumptions, which adds another layer to the argument. But here is the part that does not move, even when the numbers fight. To get to Sahul, people cross deep-water channels through Wallacea. At least one of those crossings, in many reconstructions, is long enough that drifting is not a satisfying explanation for success at scale. So whether their arrival is earlier or later, it still implies deliberate planning, boats, timing, and group coordination. That means the earliest Australians are not defined only by where they walked. They are defined by what they chose to cross when crossing meant risk with no rescue. Deep time debates stay alive because coastlines drown evidence, sediments shift, and dating always carries uncertainty. But the archaeological record still shows early occupation, tools, pigment use, and long-term adaptation across huge distances. And that tells you something that numbers alone cannot. It tells you the crossing did not end at landfall. It multiplied into thousands of journeys across the continent. It tells you people learned Sahul until it was no longer a strange world but a lived world. It tells you culture formed strong enough to survive climate shifts, rising seas, and immense regional diversity. So when the debate gets loud, return to the simplest scene that cannot be argued away. A small craft on a dark channel, the last shoreline shrinking behind it, and nothing ahead but horizon. That is the moment the boundaries of the human world changed. And once those boundaries changed, they never went back. When the first boat slipped into those deep channels, the ocean wasn't a backdrop, it was the final judge. And when they reached Sahul, they didn't just find a new land, they proved the world could be crossed on purpose. Every shoreline they learned turned into a route, and every route turned into memories strong enough to outlast rising seas. So, even if the dates are debated, the achievement is not, because no timeline removes the open water. A small craft, a dark channel, and a decision that rewrote the edge of the human world. And from that moment on, Sahul was never truly isolated again, only waiting to be understood. If you want more true, deep history documentaries like this, subscribe for the next chapter, because the oldest journeys still shape the world we live on now.